paper reports that two of the male prostitutes were given a late-night tour of the White House last year.
You want answers. I want the truth. You can't handle the truth.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Nick Bryant podcast. Today, my guest is Andrew Kreig. He is head of the Justice Integrity Project in Washington, D.C. How are you doing today, Andrew?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me on.
No problem. So you went to Cornell University and then you worked at the Hartford Courant for 14 years, which is I think one of the oldest newspapers in the country.
Exactly. It was started in 1764, and during the American Revolution, it was the largest newspaper in the country.
And then you became somewhat disillusioned with the newspaper biz, and you wrote a book called Spiked about how stories get quashed, how relevant stories get quashed, and how meaningless stories get pumped up. Would you like to talk about that?
Well, I would, although maybe it's a clarification. I wrote the book, it's an expose type of book, but it's not quite in disillusionment. It's more just applying the illusion that we as reporters can make a difference to an unusual subject, which is investigating one's own employer and one's own profession, including investigative stories. So, and that's what occurred. This 1987, I had worked at the paper for 14 years as mostly a court reporter. And magazine editor for a little bit. But I saw some trends going on that at first I thought would be kind of amusing in a way to, or at least interesting and entertaining, to write about how the country's oldest continuously published news organization was taken over by a big conglomerate that was supposed to be the best of breed, the Times Mirror Company, and all the changes that occurred. But as I dug into it more, I saw beneath the surface all kinds of problems, along with the kind of interesting history. And I tried to publish them in the journalism reviews. And all three of them, the big ones, basically said, look, this is getting too controversial. We can't publish it without checking it out. We have no way of checking it out, so goodbye. And I thought, they're all affiliated with journalism schools. Why is it hard to check out basic facts? But ultimately, I wrote a book, and it created quite a stir, and it launched me into different careers, but always with a kind of affection and hope for the news media, even as one necessarily has to take a look at the underside of it or the realities. So that's a kind of a long-winded answer. I'll try to be a little shorter.
Yeah, don't worry about that. I like to let my guests go and fully flesh something out. So don't worry about that. So Spiked, and the Hartford Courant didn't have very nice things to say about Spiked.
Well, actually, the funny thing is, they probably thought they were I was wasting my time, but I did get interviews with key people until they saw the title, which again, how chain management corrupted America's oldest newspaper. At that point, for the first and only time in my 50 years as a reporter, I got threatened with a lawsuit by my own newspaper where I'd worked from 1970 to 84. But ultimately, I just stared them down because everything in the book was true. Now, they wrote an editorial that I describe as probably the longest editorial in the history of America's oldest newspaper, because it was an entire page, except for maybe an inch and a half on the bottom, denouncing me. And they said, well, this is a horrible book, a horrible person, horrible researcher. And all of this, including some negative reactions elsewhere, were just an incentive for me to drop out of law school and spend the next year going on 100 radio and TV shows, giving interviews about the book, and until there was no one who could contradict anything about it, and then resume my career. But yeah, they didn't like it. But ultimately, this is a 1987 book, and I think it was vindicated because not only in the specifics of the book, but the general theme that there are people making decisions responsive to stockholders and giant corporations that have often very little to do with the community or sometimes the truth. And so that's what the book is about, is painting a case history that has been repeated with increasing frequency across the country, not just in newspapers, but broadcasting and all media, which I know you want to talk about a variety of media. So I'm just talking about the beginning of my career, but I think the issues apply to everything, including the internet or other electronic communications.
When we talked on the phone last week, I quoted that 90% of media imbibed by Americans is owned by 6 corporations. And we talked about that. And that number has been batted around for a number of years. And I checked on it again. And it is indeed true that 6 corporations own 90% of the media that Americans imbibe. So basically, that's your book, Spiked, on steroids right there.
Well, yes. And part of what's confusing is that there may be many affiliates, subsidiaries, so you don't really know who owns these outlets that we see. And in fact, one kind of graphic example of about 4 years ago involves a broadcasting company called Sinclair, which is based near Baltimore, and it started buying up hundreds of television stations, local television stations. And these would be under familiar call signs for the community, but also would be affiliates of all 4 of the major networks, Fox, CBS, ABC, and NBC. So it was only in the background that there's the Sinclair ownership. Now, Sinclair is run by kind of a typical, very, very conservative and financially hard-nosed type of ownership. And one of the things they wanted to do in the 2016 election was have every one of their news stations do stories that would help Republicans. And so they were billed as feature stories that almost seem like they could be from your hometown. And so the anchors, who are well known in their community, would read the feature story as if it had just happened in that place. And somebody put together a collage of about 150 of these anchors reading the same words at the same time, all together, so you could see what a travesty it was that people thought they were getting original content, when in fact it was headquarters ordering these TV stations with all the different combinations of anchors, black, white, male, female, young, old, reading with enthusiasm the same news script.
Well, that sounds kind of like Big Brother.
It's exactly like it, except that at least those of us familiar and with the story, you could identify that Big Brother was one person. Now, you may have thought he was a great guy if you were properly trained, but you could kind of identify that it was one person. And of course, Winston Smith in the George Orwell book came to dislike him, as did his love interest. They hated Big Brother. But here, you've got hundreds of journalists who are part of this pattern that's extremely hard for the ordinary news consumer to understand what's going on, why, and what the economics of it were or are.
Well, Winston ultimately embraced Big Brother and decided.
Well, that's after torture. We don't want that. We don't want that.
Decided that he loved Big Brother. So you decided to transition to law. You went to Yale and University of Chicago and became an attorney.
Yes. So I'm speaking to your audience here from Washington, D.C., Pennsylvania Avenue, halfway between the White House and Congress. And I'm across the street from the National Archives and almost about a stone's throw from the headquarters of the Justice Department and the FBI, which is across the street. Not that I would throw a stone, only maybe a Frisbee, but that's the locale. So I did transition after my book into law, and I'm glad to have done it. It was kind of a late start for anyone in the media or elsewhere thinking of a career. I'll interrupt this saga with a bit of fatherly advice. My father said, you know, you're going to be 40 years old by the time you graduate from the University of Chicago Law School with a JD. I said, Dad, I'm going to be 40 years old then anyway. I think I'm going to be better equipped for this world with a law degree than otherwise. So that worked out reasonably well. I mean, I think that was the second of about my 5 careers overall. But one of the things that I did that I think is a sequence to what we're talking about is at the University of Chicago. It was after I'd written this book and about people, both reporters, mostly unwitting reporters, but news managers who were submitting deceptive applications for journalism prizes and getting away with it. by and large. You see, that's kind of the dramatic conclusion of Spiked. Is I went to Pulitzer Prize headquarters, Columbia University, looked up the applications for some investigative prize stories, and then went back to the community and talked to prosecutors, reporters, and found serious problems with some of these investigations that the reporters didn't necessarily know, because these are stories that are being packaged and submitted for prizes. So at the University of Chicago, Nick, along with the regular studies to become a lawyer, I undertook a special research project that lasted a year. And the concept was to take a familiar concept in law and also in media circles, the marketplace of ideas, and examine the economic reality. And you've heard that expression, haven't you, many times?
I have indeed.
So the concept is everybody buys what they want, and so the world gets the right amount of media. Because if, for example, you want to be, I'll just pick a book off my shelf. If you want to read a book about how to be a best-selling author, you buy that book. If you want to raise petunias in Maryland, you buy that book. So everybody gets what they want. The system is working pretty well. But, okay, so I examined that. And the first thing I applied it to was the newspaper business, which I knew. And I knew that 70% of the revenue from most newspapers comes from advertising. So what's the marketplace? It's not the subscriber, because that's only 30%. It's the advertiser. And for TV, and that was before cable really, people pay nothing for TV. So what do the news departments owe us? Well, we hope they're not cheating or lying, but in an economic term, it's not a direct relationship when you're watching free TV news. That they obviously don't want to get caught doing bad things, but it's not the marketplace of ideas. And once you take that thought to another level, which frankly, I was too, even though I was over 40 years old, I was too not experienced enough to really grasp until I get into the kind of world of Nick Bryant and some of what you're doing. But I wanted to keep your attention here, Nick. I didn't want to lose you here, or your audience, but I know admires you. And
most of them might be on Adderall, so you don't have to worry about them.
But there's when we think about it, Kroger food stores, Macy's, they're not trying to manipulate the news that much in my experience. They probably don't want feature stories that people should go on starvation diets. But that's not, there's another factor is what I'm driving at. It's not just the 30% subscribers, the 70% advertisers. And it goes back to what I was talking about, this Sinclair Broadcasting. Some of the owners want people to vote for a certain political party. Most of them definitely don't want taxes going up. And some of them have foreign policy agendas. And some of the owners, when we think about it, are mere parts of larger conglomerates. So a lot of the people, the traditional professors and others who write about the media, act as if all of these media companies are standalone businesses where things are just subscribers and advertisers. But if I'm in Washington, D.C., you take a look at the Washington Post, which in many ways is a good newspaper, very important. I'm a subscriber. But there are certain things that they have never dared touch, like the JFK assassination, in an honest way. So there's over 2,000 books about the JFK assassination. And by my understanding, and I've studied this pretty closely, they've never given a review, and certainly not a fair review, to any book that criticizes the Warren Commission in significant depth. And let's get back, just to finish this up, keep it a conversation. The Post, for many years, was a standalone media company. They had TV stations, subsidiaries. They got into educational tutoring, which is a very bad idea in many ways, but they couldn't really make it. So Jeff Bezos bought them for $250 million. Within months, Amazon gets a 700, either 6 or 700 million, I forget, contract with the CIA to handle their computing, their cloud computing. So the Post, which is purely owned as a personal property by Jeff Bezos, it's a media company, but it's almost inseparable from this vast conglomerate that is making far more money acting as a communications enabler for federal agencies and other organizations than printing the news. And if you go kind of down the list, you'll see that type of relationship with many of the biggest media companies. So just to sum up, the marketplace of ideas, you got subscribers or viewers, then you got advertisers, and the advertisers really aren't, pulling what I sometimes call the puppet strings, but in the background, you have the very high-level owners that really don't want to get caught pulling strings, but we as analysts and reporters, just like Sherlock Holmes, sometimes he'd solve a case by what didn't happen rather than seeing the evidence. And when we see that neither the Post nor the New York Times dares write honestly about the murder of our president, John F. Kennedy, on the streets of Dallas, we know that there's something going on.
The professor that oversaw your thesis about the market of ideas was Cass Sunstein. And he doesn't think very highly of the Kennedy assassination. Actually, he doesn't think very highly of any kind of conspiratorial thought. Tell us a little bit about Cass and where he ended up.
Well, I had a couple of regular courses with him. He's a brilliant guy who's considered quite a liberal at the University of Chicago Law School, whereas it has a reputation of law and economics and conservative thinking. And so in some ways, I like doing an economic analysis at the great citadel of law and economics. And he's a constitutional scholar. And he was interested in this project. And then we went our separate ways after graduation. I worked for a federal judge as law clerk and for a big law firm, and he went on to Harvard. But what should happen? But years later, in 2008, he decides to co-author a working paper, which is like a research paper, with another professor. and it was attacking so-called conspiracy theorists. And if I could sum up the paper, which was quite something, the two authors wrote, well, the government has a problem. Millions of people believe in conspiracy theories. And their tone was, that's not good. So the government's got to do something about people who believe in conspiracy theories. And as an analyst, they came up with three solutions. One, forbid by law people to have conspiracy theories. Two, tax them. You see, this is kind of an advanced thought that you
so there
would
be a conspiracy theory tax then.
The tax, yeah, we figure out a way to tax them. But they said those are the two undesirable options. So the most desirable option for government is to have secret operatives who will penetrate the places where conspiracies flourish and disrupt the people who do these conspiracy theories. And that way, you don't have a big apparatus. You just have these people opposing conspiracy theories, and no one will know what's going on because the government doesn't get caught doing this. And some people, I think Glenn Greenwald wrote about this at the time, said, this man is co-author of the leading constitutional law textbook used in American law schools. He shouldn't have a professorship at any law school. I mean, this kind of is proof of what conspiracy theorists, whoever they are, would most fear. Secret agents penetrating at the behest of government. So the end to this particular story, which you know, is that Professor Sunstein's friend and admirer, then President Barack Obama, appoints him to a very important job at the White House, supervising all federal regulation in the United States. And this is within the Office of Management and Budget at the White House, where all of the agencies have to submit their plans. And it goes through Cass Sunstein, the Harvard professor who doesn't like conspiracies. And Cass Sunstein's wife, Samantha Power, gets a very important job at the State Department, working with Hillary Clinton. And that kind of launches her public career. She had been a journalist and then went to Harvard Law School. So she's a journalist lawyer. And she had a succession of very important jobs, as did he. And she's now the current director of U.S. Agency for International Development under President Biden. And that goes all over the world doing aid programs. So again, I apologize for a somewhat long anecdote, but I think it certainly when I was studying under him, doing this paper in 1990, the concept of conspiracy theories and money and all this stuff was not on my mind. But ultimately, he wrote this book. He developed the paper into this book, Conspiracy Theories and Other Dangerous Ideas, and he's against them. Now, I've got an entire shelf of these books on conspiracy theories, and most of them, Nick, are some well-credentialed person like Professor Sunstein, who says how dangerous they are and picks some extreme examples of obviously lunatic ideas and says this is bad for democracy. And then they get a book contract and their book is taught and reviewed. But what none of them will ever do, really, and I study this now, is take something like the JFK assassination, where there are very legitimate questions about the official story, and defend the official story. They don't want to do that because it's just much easier to describe something as crazy and cherry pick than to deal with the fact that on some occasions the alternative view is demonstrably right. The mainstream view is demonstrably wrong. And I'll just add one other thing, that beginning on the 50th anniversary of the JFK assassination, I decided personally that my then career or field was investigative reporting about the justice system, and that I had to come to grips with what really happened in Dallas, who's telling the truth, who's not. So I started going to conferences and meeting the authors, and I know pretty much all of the experts, certainly of the critics of the Warren Report. And this year I'm returning again in November to Dallas, where there are multiple research conferences, and I'm the master of ceremonies at probably the main one, which is run by Dr. Cyril Wecht, JD, MD, extremely distinguished man of 90 years, a coroner who has spoken out since the 1960s, saying physically impossible that one shooter could have killed Kennedy, as the Warren Report says. And he's stuck with that. He's written 60 books. His textbooks are, he's a medical school professor, and he's running this conference. He's asked me to, introduce people, keep the time clock. I'm not doing a very good, I promise I'll have shorter answers now. I got to get in practice for the
Don't worry about that, Andrew. We want to hear your opinions.
Well, I want to hear your questions. So
Cyril Wecht, Arlen Specter was the one who came up with the magic bullet, and I heard Cyril Wecht say the magic bullet does whatever you want it to. I always got a kick out of that.
Yes.
Why is the JFK assassination so important?
Well, it's a great question, one that I'll try to boil down. On the one level, it's just a fascinating story. A charismatic, accomplished president shot down in cold blood. The case is announced solved, and since it happened, within a few years, most of the public doesn't believe the official story. So you have a situation where all of the important media and government agencies say Oswald did it with essentially one bullet that created 13 separate penetrations of two different people, changing its flight. And you have usually over 60% of the American public saying they don't think it happened. So there's that element. The other element, and I focus primarily on the current implications, not the mysteries of 1963, although they are important. But the current implications are, if we have over 2,000 books about it, many witnesses, many whistleblowing witnesses, millions of pages of declassified documents, and we can't get the major news media to write or broadcast honest stories. What are the implications for what's going on now that affects us? So the real importance, to answer your question, is we need to know, in a troubled world in 2022 and beyond, what's going on in the world. And we have to rely, to some extent, on government and the media to let us know. And if they can't address the murder of our elected leader, honestly, we've got to keep up the scrutiny.
Your paper on the media touched on this. That there's a synergy between these mega corporations that own 90% of the media and the government. I mean, the government could break them up at any time they want, anytime it wanted, with the Sherman Antitrust Act, because these six conglomerates are monopolies. And consequently, these six conglomerates are going to be obsequious to the government because they don't want the government to break them up. And therein lies the problem, is they are going to digest whatever the government's throwing out and give it to us, package it for prime time.
Well, that's one way of framing it. And I think there are many, if not most, situations that might be relevant. But again, I'm literally right in the middle of it here. And I know a number of the people involved in this on all sides, the media, the government. So I think it's a little more complicated, Nick, and dependent on the situation. For example, if one looks at the suppression of the JFK assassination story, in my view, and according to a lot of research I've done, it's not so much the government, and certainly not the CIA, telling the media what to print. At this level that we're talking about, back then, and to some extent now, the real power brokers, they're on kind of an even level. And those of us who started in the media, like me, cub reporter, working your way up, we're imbued with the concept of the media as a watchdog over the government. And so the idea that the government would be telling the media what to do, that's very offensive. It gets our hackles up, and it's maybe reassuring to the public to think, we're fighting for them, type thing. But suppose, according to my current construct and belief and research, it's people above the levels of most government employees, or even presidents, or even above the level of elected senators, and certainly above the level of journalists, editors, and so forth, but are responsive to other bigger agendas. And they're working together with the media, with much of the media apparatus and much of the government apparatus, not even knowing what the agenda is, just their assignment, their daily assignment to get through it. And that's the danger, and that's the reality. So, for example, to take one example, this is a little political. I could pick political examples. I mean, the Kennedy assassination, that's a Democratic operation in some ways, the cover up Lyndon Johnson. But this is a Republican one. And Rupert Murdoch and Fox News are far more important than any elected politician, probably even more important than Donald Trump, although that might be close. But the members of Congress, the Senate, the governors, they do not dare violate what the Murdochs want, or Fox News and the Murdoch news empire wants. And so that's turning the media and government on its head. You have, and I saw signs of that in the local news business, where the top state prosecutor in Connecticut, who cooperated with me, but he says, don't make my name public. I can't afford to have a newspaper on my back just so you can write a magazine article. But then when I wrote a book, he said, okay, you can use what I said. In fact, he went on TV to advocate for me in my book and my findings that the newspaper was submitting phony applications for Pulitzer Prizes. So again, what would be your response to what I'm saying? I really respect what you do, and am interested in your views on these complicated topics, Nick.
Well, with these topics, I think that the Franklin scandal, for example, I live in the Mecca of publishing, New York City. And according to Wikipedia and Facebook, the Franklin scandal is a conspiracy theory. Actually, it's even worse than a conspiracy theory. It's a hoax. It has zero veracity, zero validity. And when I was pitching this story initially, and then I pitched Epstein, but I had a lot of people to pitch the Franklin scandal to, but I didn't have as many to pitch the Epstein scandal to, because they didn't want to hear from me anymore. But I think how it works, and I have a friend who worked for a major magazine, and ultimately he just couldn't take it anymore. But there's a certain zeitgeist at that magazine. And if you stray off that reservation, that's problematic for your employment. Chris Hedges comes to mind when I think about this. There were a number of reporters at the New York Times that knew the weapons of mass destruction that Bush and Cheney were talking about was a fiction. But Chris Hedges was the only one that spoke out about it. And despite him winning a Pulitzer Prize, he found himself persona non grata at the New York Times.
Well, so did Sidney Schanberg, the op-ed columnist. Let's go back to the Franklin scandal. When I read your book, Nick, I didn't know you. I didn't know
that you were going to bring props today.
Oh yeah, of course. Everyone listening to this has got to read this. It's one of the most courageous and important, and in its own way, if you find horror something you can handle, chilling books that I've ever read. Came out in 2009. I remember very clearly the powerful impact of it, and such an honor to be talking about these ideas with you 13 years later. And that was definitely a story that you poured 7 years, all your contacts, your professional reputation into. And I know it was derived not just because it was an awful, horrible scandal, but because of your abiding main career writing about children and trying to protect them in all kinds of ways, not just this kind of scandal. And of course, that leads to the Epstein, and how extremely reluctant the major media is to dig into that. And you and I and others have talked about that for years. Just so your readers know, some of us have had a little informal email list of about 6 authors exchanging information for a couple of years about that. Of course, you've pioneered going back to the beginning. I don't know how tight you are on our deadlines here, but we really should talk, I think, about what can anybody do about this, either as a media creator or as a consumer. Now, how much time do we have to address that impossible 2 questions?
I'm sure that my audience doesn't mind your hot air, Andrew. So, just keep going. But I will say one thing. I poured 7 years of my life into that book. And I wrote another book that was touching on similar subject matter. And I have been branded a conspiracy theorist.
It wouldn't be this book, would it?
That one too. Cass Sunstein would tax me because I am a conspiracy theorist.
This is a slim book, but extremely powerful. And Nick Bryant is down here as bringing it to market.
And what's interesting about those 2 books is that the Washington Times, owned by the Moonies, was the one that was reporting the truth. And they were steamrolled by the Washington Post. The Washington Post, the New York Times, and the LA Times got together and they just kicked the Washington Times to the curb. And it wasn't that difficult because the Washington Times was owned by the Unification Church. So I have some pretty strong opinions about the Washington Post and their inability to embrace the story that I wrote. And actually, they attempted assiduously to cover it up. But they're never going to budge. That's just the way it is. So here I am, branded a conspiracy theorist. What can we do about that, Andrew?
Well,
what can us conspiracy theorists do?
Well, again, it's 2-part, as either media creators or as consumers, or both. This is very timely. I was asked to give advice to a young, well-educated journalist who's extremely enthusiastic about entering our profession as a journalist. And I often have this kind of conversation at the National Press Club and elsewhere. And so I try to give it a lot of thought and not be gloomy Gus, the persecuted would-be truth teller and so forth, and just try to think, well, what's the solution for either more senior people like us or young people starting out? So here as a creator, well, it might be simpler to say start with being a consumer, which is to have diverse sources and realize that there's no perfect media organization or anything close to it. But if you educate yourself to learn the history, how important ownership is, and so forth, you can have a shot at getting the right information that you need. But the other, that's kind of a bromide, but let me illustrate it a little bit more as a news creator. So at the Justice Integrity Project, justice-integrity.org, we try to get behind the news. We have a almost daily wrap-up of Me Too and sexual blackmail. We have a daily update on media news, but most of it is investigative stories about all kinds of things, and news reports, excerpts, including about the Ukraine war. Because if you're trying to understand why these powerful people do what they do, you've got to think, well, what do they care about? And they care about foreign markets, wars, ideology, taxes, and so forth. So But I work frequently with other reporters. Much of it's just helping them do what they want to do. But here's the basic advice to creators in this. You've got to know that the system is not good, particularly for investigative journalists who are doing sensitive stuff on your own, or even within an organization, you get kicked out. And you've got to make sure you have the money to survive. And if you're counting on the big investigative story that is so daring that nobody's done it before, unfortunately, you're probably going to run out of money before you find anybody who publish it. So here's my slogan. I should have said it right at the beginning, but I've lived it and it works for me. As recently as yesterday, be the media, don't beg the media. So you're doing it, Nick, with a podcast, your books. We all send out our queries to the main organizations. Sometimes it works. Much of the time, as we get into the deeper stuff, it doesn't work. But if we can figure out how to afford rent and food and whatever else we need, our research materials, that's a good start. But it's almost impossible to make it as a freelance investigative journalist. And even working within an organization, you may have a good long run at it and maybe even end your career with it, but very unlikely. I'm active in the Hartford Current Alumni Association. When I was there, they had about 240 reporters. The hedge fund that took over the second largest news organization in New England told everybody to work from home. They fired and forced out most of the people. There's probably only about 35 writers and other journalists left. They sold the headquarters because the real estate, if they're telling people to work from home, why do they need a headquarters or a library or a printing press? They're sold for scrap metal. So this is a paper that reported the Boston Tea Party and the revolution as news. It was the defendant in the first press freedom case before the Supreme Court. They're telling people to work for home. So that's what we're doing. It's not what people want to hear. Maybe at the beginning of people's career, they can make a good run at it until they get to a certain level when they're trying to expose the big boys. And that's when it gets tough. Now, what do you...
You've just laid down a formula for utter despondency.
Well, let me put it on a happier note here. So I've been working 12 years on a big investigative story about very abusive and I would say not illegal, but maybe illegal practices within the Justice Department, which again is about 150 yards from me. And the focus of it is this special counsel that was appointed in the Trump administration to investigate Russiagate. And it's his mission to prove that Donald Trump had no significant relations with Russia that were improper at all during the presidency. So he's out indicting people. And I've found from studying his career that numerous federal judges have slapped him down in previous cases for prosecution misconduct, goes around ruining people's lives. The defendant in his most recent cases. And
who are you talking about, Andrew?
Pardon me?
Who are you talking about? So my audience.
Well, his name is John Durham, special counsel for the U.S. Justice Department. And so I pitched this story. I'm going to get to the happy ending here. So I did all this research, dozen years off and on, and I pulled it together. And starting last June, I pitched it to the Washington Post. I pitched it more recently to another couple of publications. Not even the courtesy of a response. I've got law degrees again from Yale and Chicago. I've studied the Justice Department as a reporter for 5 years full-time. Not even a response. But I went to a mutual friend of ours, an investigative reporter, and I humbled myself, Nick. And I said, you know how I've been investigating this. What should I do? And he says, write a book. And he says, you know, if you market it right, you know, Durham, he's losing all his cases. He's going to lose his job. But when the Republicans win Congress, he's going to be expert witness. He's going to have a report. He's going to be on Fox News talking about how bad the Democrats are. And you'll have the book on him. And so you don't need to go hat in hand and to these publications, because you'll have the book. And then what I did was I went to another publication where I'm on the editorial advisory board, and it's a smaller circulation one, and they love the story. They immediately accepted it. They probably only changed 2,200 words. They probably only changed 4 or 5, and it's going to go out. And so it'll be smaller publications called Global Strategic View, worldwide audience that cares about this stuff, and then a book. And so it's an example of be the media, don't beg the media, and stack up on, it's a joke. My family knows I buy garbanzo beans by the Costco. You know, we're doing things in a very frugal way, but we're churning out the copy and not being dependent on the editors who don't even bother to take 8 seconds to say it's not for us.
After the Franklin scandal came out, I went through a very, very difficult time financially. And but I found chicken pot pies at Key Foods for 99 cents. And if you put a lot of pepper on them, they actually taste pretty good. But I will say at this point that I will never, ever, as long as I live, eat another chicken pot pie.
Well, I've got these big cans of garbanzos, and I'll ship one down. Do we have time? Maybe it's a concluding story, but it gets to the heart and soul of Washington journalism. Do you have time for that?
Oh yeah, we got time.
All right. So one time, this is about 8 years ago. By the way, I wrote a book called Presidential Puppetry.
And I wanted to talk to you about that too.
So the concept of presidential puppetry, it's that there's a layer above the presidents that really decides things. And I became aware of that. And in fact, maybe one thing I should mention is after I became a lawyer, I became vice president and then head for 12 years of a major high-tech association. And at all these companies like Home Box Office, mostly startups, to advance the concept of wireless internet between 1993 and 2008. So we were ultimately recruiting big companies like AT&T and Google to our board. So that's another interlude. But this concept of presidential politics, virtually nobody, Nick, in the press, even who could cover the White House, could answer 2 simple questions. What was President Obama's first job out of college? And what did his mother do for a living? And you'd think that experienced reporters would know that about a 2-time president, but they don't. They think, well, he's a community organizer. No. Former Navy intelligence. He taught me how to look up declassified CIA documents when I got back into journalism in 2009. And he pointed me to one that showed that President Obama's first job was with a research company called
BIC.
Business International. And why don't you, so that people don't have to keep listening to me, tell the audience what BIC was.
BIC was a multinational corporation, and it provided covers to CIA agents.
Well, ostensibly, it was a research. They sold research. And President Obama has told biographers, well, it was so boring, I left to become a community organizer. But what pointed out to me was that the owner of it said it worked with the Central Intelligence Agency.
Yes.
At times provided cover for people who didn't want to be known as CIA people. And so that's his first job. And to work later as a community organizer, it adds a whole dimension of relationships. And when you look at these presidents, as I did for my book, all of them, after Jimmy Carter, had relationships with the CIA or FBI before they entered politics. And I say that that's not necessarily bad, but it's certainly something the public should know that they don't know, and not even the reporters know. And I know because I've asked them, and they don't know that Obama's mother, the people vaguely think she was some kind of hippie single mother who liked to study plants. Well, she was an anthropologist, but she worked for the Ford Foundation, and she was very connected, and the whole family was connected, not as employees of intelligence agencies, but as kind of assets, it's called. And again, it's not necessarily bad. In fact, it might make them more experienced, but it's something that the public should know but doesn't.
I'm nonpartisan. I'm not a Republican. I'm not a Democrat. And I haven't voted for a Republican or a Democrat for many years. So I don't really have a problem with people because of the parties that they're in. But I wrote an article about Obama and his mother. And his mother was definitely involved with intelligence and intrigue, certainly in Indonesia, and probably later in Afghanistan with the Russians. And I wrote that article, and I knew that I had to write that article. And the article is solid, but I knew that I couldn't pitch it, that I had to write it. This was kind of after I'd been somewhat ostracized. And I wrote the article, I gave it to the contacts that I still had, no one touched it, but it's on my blog. So if you want to read about Obama's
I'd love to.
Failed past, you can look at my blog.
I'll look for it. I wasn't familiar with it. Here's two things, and I'm sure we're getting toward the end here, but one is I'm trying to impart some practical and maybe uplifting thoughts. So we talked at some length about how I've been spiked and so forth, and this more recent story. Let me say that to listeners, whether you're a consumer or creator, my advice is to approach things in a hopeful way and don't judge media organizations or people or others, including political government people, with a solid broad brush. So, for example, I now work with closely with Dr. William Pepper, who was a friend of Dr. Martin Luther King and is counsel for Sirhan Sirhan, the accused killer of RFK. And I was able to get a reporter at the Washington Post to write a very important, historically important Sunday front page article in the Post on RFK. I invited him to go up to a conference, research conference at Duquesne University led by Dr. Cyril Wecht. And he came back and wrote this huge story saying that a number of people in the Kennedy family do not believe that Sirhan killed Robert Kennedy. Physically impossible. So that's just one example. I'll give other examples. I'm very active in a bunch of journalism associations, clubs, professional societies. And while a lot of people complain about the dues, I think, well, these, they tried to kick me out of the business 35 years ago, and I'm still here. And I'm active in all of these groups. I just am publishing an article this week with the National Press Club, and there's a whole bunch of others. So my suggestion is be active, be hopeful, and figure things out so you can get your stories out. But you got to figure out a way to make a living, or at least get your garbanzo beans at $2.99 at Costco. Some other way.
How do you like your garbanzo beans?
I like them a lot. When you think about it, the little things of hummus that you get, that's made out of garbanzos.
Absolutely.
So you do it yourself. The other thing, and this is a very important money-making concept, and it's not mine, but for you and your audience, I'll share it. So probably about 8 years ago, I was looking into a conspiracy theory that secretaries of state and companies could change election results. And everybody said, no, it can't happen. Can't happen. My tipster said, yes, it can happen, and it has happened. So I went to the annual Secretary of State's conference here in Washington, and, as press, and I was working for the Wayne Madsen report, named by our friend. And I wanted to ask a major media figure, what's his name, Todd, on MSNBC. He had said it could never happen that anybody could affect elections electronically or otherwise. And I knew that wasn't true. And I wanted to be able to ask him a question at the lunch where the secretaries of state. So I go in there, and having been in the convention business, I see that there was an entire table where they'd laid out the dessert cheesecake, and no one was there. And I thought, while waiting for the speech to be over so I could ask my question, I'll have some cheesecake. And I like cheesecake. So there's a second cheesecake there. They're going to throw it out. They paid for it. I had the second cheesecake. So
that's the optimism you want to give to our my audience, is to have to.
Oh, no, we're getting to the money making part here. So I asked my question to, who is it? Chuck Todd. That's who it is. And I said, you said in a tweet that there's never been a case of election fraud in the U.S. Do you stand by that? And he said, yes, it couldn't happen. And the secretaries of state run elections. They buy the equipment. That's who sponsors the thing. So to get to the point of the story, he answered it. I was able to use that quote for 2 chapters in presidential puppetry, that the media is not watching out for election fraud. So it was a huge success, except that the executive director, or the PR director, immediately after I asked my question, came in and pulled me out and started haranguing me. And she said, you're not supposed to ask a question. That's only for the secretaries of state to talk to him, Chuck Todd. And furthermore, I saw that you ate 2 pieces of cheesecake there. And not only are we going to charge you for the whole dinner, but we're going to complain to your management. Now, what's your organization? And I said, well, I came here with the Wayne Madsen report. And she said, well, we're going to call up and complain about him, but we want to check for this lunch and you're forbidden to come back. And so, I'm in the doghouse, and Wayne has never let me forget about it, but he did come up with his own money-making scheme that I'm going to share with you and the readers. And he says, first of all, I told that person when they called, that's disgraceful, because when we send out our people, particularly a big guy like him, I'm ashamed that he had only 2 pieces of cheesecake. We instruct our staff to take as much as possible. And if there were 8 of them on the table, he should have had more than that. And of course, they didn't know what to make of this. But, Wayne's view was even at big organizations, reporters don't make much. And certainly freelancers are expected to take as much food as they can. And here's the money-making idea that he came up with, which would be branded Ziploc bags that he would sell to reporters with his initials of his news site, WMR Ziploc bags, and sell them to reporters so that when you go to events like this, they can take home multiple slices of roast beef and cheesecake. And he thinks that will help him keep going as an investigative reporter by selling Ziploc bags to take free food. Now, what do you think of that?
Well, I mean, as long as there's no conspiracy tax, it's all right. But I mean, how much are the Ziploc bags? How much is he selling?
Well, they wouldn't cost much. And, maybe he'd sell them for $2. People, could go in proudly to these banquets and take out their branded Wayne Madsen Ziploc bags.
I think that's a winner. I just might steal that idea. Nick Bryant Ziploc bags. I mean, I think it has a nice ring.
It could be franchised throughout the country, throughout the world. It could be kind of the new Starbucks concept of franchising.
In former incarnation, I used to cover science conferences. I was a science reporter, and big pharma or big tech, when I'd go to one of those conferences, would give us an unbelievable spread because they wanted us to write about them. And now I really could have used those Ziploc bags back then.
Wayne is a genius, and he also made me happy because remember, just a couple of days ago, I was thinking, I've researched this John Durham special prosecutor who's getting headlines all the time in major broadcasts and newsmag, and I'm the one with the story, and I can't even I'm a former magazine editor, which I put in my query, and they won't even give the courtesy of it stinks or not for us. And Wayne says, in effect, be the media, write a book, get it out, promote it. You got to promote it, though, because there's hundreds of thousands of books published. By the way, I've become a book publisher. And here's one. I'll just show it kind of quickly. There is a man from the old Soviet Union. Here he is. And he was a close friend of Lee Harvey Oswald. And this man, Professor Totovitz, has an MD and PhD. And he wrote a memoir, 500 pages, of the times he knew Lee Oswald and what a good guy he was. And the implication is the people who think Oswald killed Kennedy, that's nuts. So this was privately published. I got to know him years ago. And I said, I can help you get your book out. And so I became a book publisher. And this is out in hardcover, Oswald Russian Experience. He's He's now about 87. I arranged an interview with Peter Dale Scott, great scholar who is helped popularize the term deep state politics. And again, this is to end up with a kind of hopeful view, which is, all right, we face problems in the world on issues, assassinations, pollution. Out there somewhere are reporters and others who will help us. It's hard to find outlets that will help us. But in the meantime, be the media, don't beg the media, and get your Ziploc bags.
What I found with the Franklin scandal, when it came out, no one wanted to talk to me. I was talking to these people that were obviously, I would say, fairly unstable psychologically. And they had their podcasts or radio shows. And I just could not get any traction with it. And I sent it to anti-trafficking organizations. And but now the Franklin scandal is selling relatively well. And
it should.
I've been invited to speak at the National Center on Sexual Exploitation's International Summit. This is the third time that I've spoken at the summit.
Well, that's good. And here's another bit of practical advice that I got from my late mother. I grew up in New York City, and she was an investigative author, and she kind of figured out the system. And she said, join organizations. One thing she always told me, and your viewers have seen the results, she said, buy other people's books, help other authors. Don't be hanging around waiting for a review copy. Just spend the money, get the book, join the organizations, be active, and help others. And it's a circle of relationships. And the other thing is, as you're doing, don't lay the whole big story on them if they don't want it, but take the part that they do want, as you're doing, and get the credibility and expand out from there. So one of the things I find in some of my journalism organizations, I don't even talk about things like JFK or other stuff because people just pull back, and I that's not the venue for it, unfortunately. Maybe individuals, but there's a herd mentality that's it is what it is. So, there's one other thing, and maybe if you have me back, we can talk about it or continue at least briefly. But one thing I talk about
well, as I said, I'm sure I've got some listeners on Adderall, and they're probably quite engaged.
Well,
so keep going.
One very important dimension that I talk all the time with Wayne Madsen and some other people is reporters, authors, is that it's not just the mainstream media that there's a problem, but the alternative media is filled with cranks, propagandists, people have lost their marbles. And so when we're trying to do serious research, we've got to confront the problem that we're either surrounded with people who are not necessarily responsible journalists and researchers, or that the people running the things are getting their clues from Cass Sunstein and other and want to censor all of us. And this is a very difficult problem. Twitter's facing it. We've got Elon Musk who says, well, they censor too much stuff. He's going to buy it and let everybody talk. Well, yeah, except that when people criticize him on his Twitter account, personal, he immediately blocks them. So now he's going to run the whole thing, and he's under the guise everybody can say anything except against him and people he likes. So this is another insoluble problem that let's try to solve, Nick. What are your thoughts?
It's tough. I've taken a very difficult path when I started with the Franklin scandal. I didn't think it was going to be as difficult as it was. But where I have problems is something like QAnon. People want to people who've never read anything that I've written want to peg me as a QAnon. And that is problematic. Or people want to talk to me about Pizzagate, and that's also problematic. It's very difficult because a book like the Franklin scandal, although I put 7 years into it and it's immaculately researched,
it is.
That topic is going to draw people in that aren't necessarily sincere or sane. And I wrote the Franklin scandal to really set the record straight on the Franklin scandal. And I found that people would rather have their own versions of the Franklin scandal instead of the version. And when I'm talking about their own versions, I'm talking about the Illuminati and shape-shifting reptilians all woven into the Franklin scandal. And that has been, I can roll with it now, but initially that was very, very difficult for me. That I put all this serious research into it, and I'm giving a radio interview and someone's asking me, how are the Illuminati connected to it? So, and I'm generally not a nice guy in situations like that, right? Or I don't come across as magnanimous in situations like that. Well, Andrew, it's been great interviewing you.
Well, I've really enjoyed it, Nick, and want to wish you the best. And I'm honored that you're really one of the most courageous people. I know I'm talking too much, but I just pick up on one of the things you said.
I pay
a lot of people don't want to get into it. Part of it is some people have died doing the kind of research that you're doing on the Franklin scandal. So that has something to do with, or been falsely sent to prison. That's part of why I admire you so much, but it's also partly why some people chicken out. So thank you for having me, and what a pleasure it's been to swap ideas with you and your audience.